The barbell slipped from his weathered hands, not because he couldn't hold it, not because the weight was too much, but because the young man behind him shoved past without a word, knocking into his shoulder like he wasn't even there. Harold steadied himself against the rack, his 78-year-old frame absorbing the impact with the same quiet dignity he'd carried for decades. The gym fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the music resumed, the conversations picked up, and life moved on as if nothing had happened. Nobody helped him. Nobody even looked. In a room full of 40 people, Harold Wilson might as well have been invisible. He bent down slowly, his arthritic joints protesting as he retrieved the weight. The young man was already 3 stations away, earbuds in, completely oblivious to what he'd done. Or maybe he just didn't care. Harold had seen that look before. The look that said he was just another old man taking up space in a world that belonged to the younger generation. He straightened up, adjusted his faded Marines t-shirt, and continued his workout in silence. This wasn't new. This was Tuesday, and Wednesday, and every other day he came to Gold's Gym on Riverside Drive. For 3 years now, since Martha passed, this place had become his routine, not because he loved the noise or the crowds, but because the alternative was sitting alone in a house that echoed with memories. The disrespect stung, but Harold had endured worse. Much worse. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when you were outnumbered 40-1. So he moved to the next exercise, keeping his head down, staying in his lane, just like he'd done every day since retiring from his job at the hardware store, just like he'd done since becoming another forgotten face in a society that worshipped youth and speed. But they had no idea who they were looking at. The young trainer, barely 25, walked past Harold's bench without acknowledgement. The college kids dominated the free weights, their laughter echoing off the walls as they shared videos on their phones between sets. The middle-aged professionals kept their eyes glued to their smartwatches, tracking every rep, every calorie, every second of their carefully optimized routines. And Harold? Harold was furniture, background noise, a relic from another time who somehow wandered into their space. He'd been coming here long enough to recognize the patterns. The morning crowd was different from the evening rush, but the treatment was the same. Polite indifference at best, casual dismissal at worst. The staff knew his name from his membership card, but that was where the familiarity ended. He paid his monthly fee, used the equipment respectfully, cleaned up after himself, and disappeared back into the anonymity of suburban retirement. If you believe that every person deserves basic respect regardless of their age, hit that like button now. Because what's about to happen will change how you see the elderly veterans in your own community. This story isn't just about Harold. It's about the thousands of heroes walking among us, invisible and unrecognized, carrying stories that would humble us all. Harold finished his chest routine and moved toward the cardio section. The treadmills were mostly occupied, but he found his usual spot on the recumbent bike in the corner. It wasn't his preferred machine, but it was quiet, tucked away from the main traffic flow. He could pedal in peace, watching CNN on the mounted television, occasionally catching glimpses of his reflection in the mirror-covered walls. That reflection told a story most people chose not to read. The slight stoop in his shoulders from decades of physical labor, the careful way he moved, compensating for old injuries that flared up on cold mornings. The wedding ring he still wore 3 years after Martha's funeral, because taking it off felt like losing her all over again. The dog tags he kept tucked under his shirt, close to his heart, where they'd remained for 57 years. What happened next would silence an entire room and change everything these people thought they knew about the quiet old man in the corner. Harold's story began in 1967, when he was 19 years old and the world was on fire. Vietnam was consuming young American lives at an unprecedented rate, and Harold Wilson, fresh out of high school in small-town Illinois, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. While his classmates headed to college or found ways to avoid the draft, Harold walked into the Marine Corps recruiting station and volunteered. He wasn't driven by politics or patriotism in the abstract sense. He was driven by something simpler and more profound: The belief that when your country called, you answered. His father had served in World War II, his grandfather in the First World War. Military service wasn't just a duty in the Wilson family. It was a tradition, a rite of passage, a way of proving that you were willing to put something bigger than yourself first. Boot camp at Parris Island broke him down and built him back up in ways that 19-year-old Harold couldn't have imagined. The drill instructors stripped away his civilian softness and replaced it with Marine Corps steel. They taught him to shoot, to fight, to follow orders without question, and to never leave a fellow Marine behind. Most importantly, they taught him that being a Marine wasn't just a job. It was an identity that would stay with him long after he hung up the uniform. By early 1968, Private First Class Harold Wilson was on a transport plane headed for Southeast Asia, his stomach churning with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He'd trained for this moment, but no amount of preparation could ready a young man for the reality of combat. The heat hit him first when they landed in Da Nang, then the smell, then the sound of distant artillery that would become the soundtrack to the next 13 months of his life. Harold was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, operating in the northern provinces of South Vietnam. His unit was tasked with conducting search and destroy missions, clearing villages of enemy combatants, and protecting supply routes from constant attack. It was dangerous, exhausting work that aged young men decades in the span of months. The old Harold, the boy from Illinois who'd worried about high school football games and Saturday night dates, disappeared somewhere in the jungle outside Hue City. In his place emerged a Marine who could navigate hostile territory in the dark, who could remain calm under heavy enemy fire, who could make life-and-death decisions in split seconds. The transformation wasn't voluntary. It was survival. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a story that would span decades and touch countless lives in ways Harold himself never fully understood. The defining moment of Harold's military service came on March 15, 1969, during what intelligence reports called a routine patrol near the DMZ. Harold's squad was moving through thick jungle when they walked into a carefully planned ambush. Enemy fire erupted from 3 sides, turning the peaceful morning into a nightmare of bullets, explosions, and screaming. Harold's squad leader went down in the first volley, shot through the chest and bleeding heavily. The medic was pinned behind a fallen log 50 yards away, unable to reach the wounded man. Enemy fighters were closing in from the north, and retreat seemed impossible. In that moment, with chaos erupting around him, Harold made a decision that would earn him decorations he never talked about, and memories that would haunt his dreams for the next 56 years. Without waiting for orders, Harold laid down covering fire and sprinted across open ground toward his fallen squad leader. Bullets whined past his head, kicking up dirt around his feet, but he kept running. He reached the wounded Marine, hoisted him over his shoulder, and began the terrifying journey back to safety. Halfway there, a piece of shrapnel from an incoming mortar round tore through Harold's left leg, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Marines don't leave Marines behind. He delivered his squad leader to the medic, then immediately returned to the firefight. For the next 4 hours, Harold Wilson exhibited the kind of courage that military historians write about, but civilians can barely comprehend. He coordinated defensive positions, directed air support, and personally evacuated 2 more wounded Marines while under continuous enemy fire. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Harold still at his post, blood seeping through his torn fatigues, calmly providing security for his wounded comrades. The Silver Star citation would later read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy while serving with Company F, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." Lance Corporal Wilson's heroic actions and selfless devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. But Harold never read those words aloud to anyone. The medal went into a box in his closet, along with his Purple Heart and combat action ribbon. Some honors, he believed, were too heavy to wear casually. Some stories were too sacred to tell at parties or family gatherings. Some experiences changed you so fundamentally that sharing them felt like trying to explain color to someone born blind. When Harold returned home in late 1969, America was a different country than the one he'd left. The war had become deeply Unpopular, and returning veterans found themselves caught between a grateful older generation and a younger cohort that saw them as symbols of an unjust conflict. Harold learned quickly to keep his service to himself. It was easier than dealing with the complex emotions his uniform seemed to trigger in others. He used his GI benefits to learn a trade, married Martha in 1974, and built a quiet life in the suburbs of Chicago. He worked construction for 15 years, then managed the local hardware store until retirement. He raised 2 children who moved to different states for better opportunities. He paid his taxes, voted in every election, volunteered at the VFW when his schedule allowed, and never once complained about the lack of recognition or gratitude. Then something extraordinary happened that would reveal the true measure of the man everyone had dismissed as just another elderly gym member. T4. Announcement came over the gym sound system just as Harold was finishing his cool-down stretches. It was Veterans Day, and the gym's management had decided to do something special. The manager, a young woman named Jessica who'd taken over the previous year, had been working with the local VFW to identify and honor veterans in their membership. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. Jessica's voice echoed through the facility. The music stopped. Conversations paused. Even the most dedicated athletes looked up from their workouts. Today is Veterans Day, and we want to take a moment to recognize the veterans among our members who have served our country with honor and distinction. Harold felt his stomach tighten. He'd filled out the veteran status on his membership application 3 years ago, probably forgot about it immediately afterward. He tried to make himself smaller in the corner, hoping to avoid any attention. He wasn't comfortable with public recognition. Never had been. We're going to call out the names of our veteran members, and we'd like them to stand so we can show our appreciation, Jessica continued. First, we have Army veteran Robert Chen, who served 2 tours in Afghanistan. A young man near the free weights stood up, looking slightly embarrassed but proud. The gym erupted in applause. People who'd never spoken to him before were clapping, nodding, some even approaching to shake his hand. Next, we have Navy veteran Patricia Williams, who served during Desert Storm. A middle-aged woman on the elliptical machine raised her hand, smiling broadly as the applause continued. Harold watched the scene unfold, feeling simultaneously proud of the recognition these veterans were receiving and increasingly anxious about his own inevitable moment in the spotlight. And finally, Jessica's voice carried across the suddenly quiet gym. We have Marine Corps veteran Harold Wilson. The silence that followed was different from the respectful quiet that had preceded the other announcements. This silence carried weight, anticipation, and something else Harold couldn't quite identify. He stood slowly, his 78-year-old joints protesting, his face flushed with embarrassment and discomfort. Harold served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969, Jessica continued, reading from notes provided by the VFW. He was awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in action, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and the Combat Action Ribbon for sustained operations against enemy forces. The gym remained silent, but Harold could feel every eye in the room focused on him. The young man who'd knocked into him earlier that morning was staring with an expression Harold had never seen before. The college kids had put down their phones. The middle-aged professionals had stopped checking their watches. But there's more, Jessica said, her voice taking on a different tone. According to the VFW records, Harold Wilson is also the recipient of the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat, for actions taken during the siege of Firebase Charlie on March 15, 1969. That's when it happened. One person started clapping, then another. Then the entire gym erupted in applause that seemed to shake the walls. But it wasn't just applause. People were standing, all of them. The young trainer who'd ignored him for 3 years. The college students who'd treated him like furniture. The professionals who'd never made eye contact. Every single person in that gym was on their feet, clapping for the quiet old man in the faded Marines t-shirt. Harold stood there, overwhelmed by the moment, feeling emotions he'd kept buried for decades rising to the surface. This wasn't what he'd wanted. This wasn't what he'd expected. But as he looked around the room at all these faces, some of them with tears in their eyes. He realized that maybe, just maybe, this was what he'd needed. The transformation in the gym was immediate and profound. The young man who'd knocked into Harold that morning was the first to approach, his face red with embarrassment and shame. He extended his hand, and when Harold took it, the young man's voice cracked as he spoke. "Sir, I am so sorry for this morning. I had no idea. I mean, that's no excuse, but I'm sorry." His grip was firm, respectful, the handshake of someone who suddenly understood the gravity of his earlier disrespect. Harold looked at this young man, probably the same age he'd been when he'd volunteered for Vietnam, and saw something that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Not just of Harold's military service, but of his humanity, his dignity, his right to occupy space in this world with the same respect as anyone else. "No harm done, son," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "We all have things on our minds." But the young man wasn't ready to let it go that easily. "Would you mind if I asked, what was it like? Over there, I mean. My grandfather served in Vietnam, but he never talked about it." Harold studied the young man's face, seeing genuine curiosity and respect where earlier there had been only indifference. This was a conversation he'd avoided for decades, but something about this moment, this setting, this unexpected recognition made it feel different. "It was a long time ago," Harold said carefully, "but I'll tell you what I told my own children when they asked. We went because we were asked to go. We did our jobs because that's what Marines do, and we looked out for each other because that's how you survive when everything around you is trying to kill you." The gym had gradually returned to normal activity levels, but there was a different energy now. People who'd never spoken to Harold before were nodding respectfully when they passed. The staff was treating him with a deference that bordered on reverence. The college students had invited him to join their conversation about military history. The middle-aged professionals were asking about his workout routine, genuinely interested in how he maintained his fitness at 78. Harold found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously uncomfortable with the attention and grateful for the recognition. For 3 years, he'd been invisible in this place. Now he was the center of attention, and people were hanging on his every word. It was overwhelming, but it was also healing in ways he hadn't expected. The trainer, Marcus, approached with a mixture of professional interest and personal shame. "Mr. Wilson, I've been working here for 2 years, and I'm embarrassed to say I never really talked to you before today. Would you be interested in working with me on a modified training program? I'd love to learn from your experience." Harold looked at this young man, probably 25 years old, full of enthusiasm and energy, and saw an opportunity to bridge a gap that had existed for too long. "I'd like that, Marcus. I'd like that very much." As the day wore on, Harold realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. For years, he'd accepted his invisibility as the natural order of things. Old men were supposed to fade into the background, supposed to make room for the next generation, supposed to carry their stories quietly until those stories died with them. But recognition had awakened something in Harold that he'd forgotten existed. Pride. Not just in his military service, though that was certainly part of it. Pride in his resilience, his character, his right to be seen and heard and valued for the man he'd become through 7 decades of living. The realization brought with it a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude for this unexpected moment of recognition, but sadness for all the other Harold Wilsons out there, carrying their stories in silence, invisible to a world that had forgotten how to see them. When Harold finally left the gym that afternoon, he carried himself differently. His shoulders were straighter, his steps more confident. The same body that had absorbed a young man's careless shove that morning now moved with renewed purpose. He was still 78 years old. He still lived alone in a house full of memories. He still missed Martha every day, but he was no longer invisible. And that changed everything. The weeks that followed brought changes Harold couldn't have anticipated. Word of the Veterans Day recognition spread beyond the gym, finding its way into the local newspaper and eventually onto social media. The story, resonated with people who had their own Harold Wilsons in their lives, grandparents and elderly neighbors whose service and sacrifice had been forgotten in the rush of modern life. Harold received letters from strangers thanking him for his service. Local schools invited him to speak about Vietnam and military history. The VFW asked him to participate in Memorial Day ceremonies. For a man who'd spent decades in the shadows, the sudden spotlight was both gratifying and exhausting. But the most meaningful changes were smaller, more personal. His relationship with his adult children deepened as they finally began asking questions about his military service. His neighbors stopped to chat when they saw him working in his yard. The staff at the grocery store knew his name. He was no longer just another face in the crowd. At the gym, Harold had become something of a legend. New members were told his story as part of their informal orientation. The young man who'd knocked into him that first day, whose name was Tyler, had become something close to a friend. They spotted each other during workouts, shared stories about their lives, bridged the 50-year gap between them with mutual respect and genuine affection. Marcus, the trainer, had developed a specialized program for Harold that took into account his age, his old injuries, and his remarkable determination to stay strong. Their sessions had become as much about mentorship as fitness, with Harold sharing hard-earned wisdom about perseverance, sacrifice, and the importance of serving something larger than yourself. The gym itself had changed too. Management had instituted a formal veteran recognition program, ensuring that no military service member would ever again go unnoticed or unappreciated. They'd partnered with local veteran organizations to provide free memberships for struggling veterans, funded in part by donations from members who'd been moved by Harold's story. But perhaps the most significant change was in Harold himself. The recognition had awakened something that had been dormant for too long, a sense of purpose beyond his daily routine. He began volunteering regularly at the VA hospital, visiting with younger veterans who were struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. He found that his story, his quiet strength, his example of resilience had power to heal and inspire in ways he'd never imagined. As Harold reflected on the months since that unexpected Veterans Day announcement, he realized that visibility had been both a gift and a responsibility. People were watching him now, looking to him as an example of dignity in aging, of service without expectation of reward, of quiet heroism that existed in countless American communities. He thought often about the other elderly veterans in gyms and grocery stores and neighborhoods across the country, carrying their own stories of service and sacrifice in silence. How many Harold Wilsons were out there, invisible to a society that had forgotten how to see them? How many heroes were walking among us, unrecognized and unappreciated? The answer, he knew, was thousands, maybe tens of thousands, men and women, who'd answered their country's call, who'd served with honor and distinction, who'd returned home to build quiet lives of dignity and service, asking for nothing more than the right to grow old with the same respect they'd shown their country. In youth, Harold's story had become bigger than Harold himself. It had become a reminder that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and ceremony. Sometimes it walks quietly among us, waiting patiently for the moment when someone finally takes the time to look, to see, to recognize the extraordinary courage that hides behind ordinary faces. On a Tuesday morning 6 months after that life-changing Veterans Day, Harold walked into Gold's Gym with the same quiet dignity he'd always carried. But now, instead of being invisible, he was greeted by name. Instead of being ignored, he was welcomed. Instead of being just another old man taking up space, he was recognized for what he'd always been, a hero. The young man at the front desk nodded respectfully. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Have a great workout, sir." Harold smiled, adjusted his Marines t-shirt, and headed toward the free weights. Tyler waved from across the room, already warming up for their planned workout together. Marcus approached, with Harold's customized training plan, eager to help him maintain the strength and vitality that had carried him through 7 decades of remarkable living. As Harold began his routine, he caught his reflection in the mirror-covered walls. The same 78-year-old body looked back at him, but something fundamental had changed. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer forgotten. He was exactly what he'd always been, but now the world could see it too. A Marine, a hero, a man whose service and sacrifice had earned him the right to grow old with dignity and respect. In a world that often forgets its elderly veterans, Harold Wilson's story serves as a powerful reminder that heroism doesn't retire, courage doesn't fade with age, and every old man or woman carrying themselves with quiet dignity might be carrying stories that would humble us all. The next time you see an elderly veteran in your gym, your grocery store, your neighborhood, remember Harold's story. Remember that recognition costs nothing but can mean everything. Remember that behind every weathered face might be a hero waiting patiently for someone to finally see them for who they truly are. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to look more closely at the elderly veterans in your own community, take a moment to share it. Because somewhere out there, another Harold Wilson is walking in silence, carrying stories of service and sacrifice that deserve to be honored, not forgotten. The greatest tribute we can pay to our veterans isn't just thanking them for their service. It's seeing them, truly seeing them, for the heroes they've always been.